2002, 2003 in detail. But I want to establish your mindset at this particular point. There you were, you'd had a long career in the CIA. You were then tapped up to become involved in this particular mission, to be a key player in the interrogation of a so-called high-value target. At the time, that was a job you desperately wanted, was it not?
Well, I think everyone in the CIA, particularly operations officers, which is what I was, an officer in the field whose job is to recruit spies, wanted to be involved in our efforts against Al-Qaeda. Of course, 9/11 was a horrific event, and the CIA in particular had been seized with the threat that Al-Qaeda posed for years and years before 9/11. I personally had been involved directly on Taliban and Al-Qaeda issues for the immediate preceding 4 years just before 9/11. So it was an honor to be involved in what was considered one of the premier coups and successes of the American counterterrorism effort.
Yeah, well, never mind an honor. I mean, your blood was boiling to a certain extent. After 9/11, you describe how, you wanted to interrogate this particular guy, the high-value target. You called him an SOB. You said, this is your thought at the time, 9/11 has really unleashed us. You used the word vengeance. That was your mindset, wasn't it?
Well, certainly I did want to be involved in the interrogation. It was the operation that came to me. I think I probably would have chosen to be involved in classic intelligence operations, collecting information if I had had the choice, but this was, it was a significant event to be brought into one of the top cases involving one of the detainees. Now, the blood boiling, I think I was describing the general reaction of everyone in the United States. To see 3,000 people incinerated does make you angry.
Yeah, I suppose the point I'm getting to is that you wanted to do this. You had a notion of vengeance. I mean, it's a word you do use in the book. And you also went into it not as an ingenue, but with your eyes wide open, a long-time CIA operative who had discussions along these lines. I just want to read this out to you. With a senior colleague about this particular mission, you asked at one point, suppose our partners do something, this is in terms of the interrogation, to the prisoner that I consider unacceptable. You just walk away, said your colleague. You walk out of the room, then you won't have seen it, you won't have been a party to anything, will you? Now, that was the sort of basis upon which you took the mission. You knew exactly what you were getting into.
Well, I was concerned from the first minute of the first briefing of the case that we would be involved, or I would become involved in practices or issues that were certainly the critical ones of my career, and I thought immediately, the critical ones for the CIA in the United States since the war, since World War II. So I was immediately concerned, which in the conversation that you cite in part, was my effort from the first to establish, well, do we have legal authorization to do this? What is it we're expected to do, and how does one act appropriately? But so I was aware from the first second. Well, I can't say, it's not correct to characterize me as enthusiastic or embracing that, however.
No, okay, but you asked about the legal standing of this, and you were shown a letter which was written by a senior Justice Department lawyer, which was described as basically the President's instructions, and those instructions essentially amounted to if the President says it's legal, then it is legal. You, on the one hand, claim that you felt that was problematic, tendentious, shoddy, you say, hack work, but on the other hand, off you went on the mission anyway. I just slightly confused about the way in which you told yourself everything was going to be fine.
Well, I didn't say everything was going to be fine. I think it's a little tendentious, actually, how you're characterizing it. The conversation went as follows. I was told that we had captured one of the top members of Al-Qaeda, top half dozen or so. I can't name who he was, although other people have.
Well, I thought you might say that, and I think it will help our audience if we just. You say you can't confirm who it was, but it has been extensively reported that the high-value target was a gentleman called Haji Pasha Wazir, who at the time was described as bin Laden's banker, although that seems to have been erroneous. And it seems you first came across him working in Morocco, where you were working with Moroccan officials on the interrogation, and of course then he was taken to a CIA black site in Afghanistan. Now that's the background, isn't it?
There are competent journalists who I think have worked out the facts, but I can't say directly myself what they are. But it's important. I can talk about how I was initially briefed on this and what my thoughts were. which differ, I think, from your characterization a bit. So I was told that we had this man, and then they said, we're interrogating him, the interrogation is not going well, and you will do whatever it takes to get him to talk. Do you understand? And I was shocked, and I immediately understood, at least what I took to be the case, and I'm sure I was right. And I said, well, we don't do that. And the answer was, well, we do now. And so then my thought was, well, we would need, and my comment was, we would need at least a presidential finding. That's a term of art for a direct presidential order authorizing a certain action for the CIA. And this response was, well, we have it. The "it" was the letter you alluded to by John Yoo from the Justice Department that I saw later, which was, I felt, just as you characterized it, not an oppressive piece of work, although as an operations officer, of course, I must defer to the lawyers. So I thought, well, we're at war. The rules have clearly changed. This appears to be, everything appears to be in order. Holy smoke. In order, meaning that the president authorized this, the Department of Justice had established this was legal, the CIA had attained clear legal guidance on what to do. All of that had been in order. So then the dilemma became immediate and very serious for me, and this is why I wrote the book. What does one do? When does one decide one has to say no to something that's unacceptable? I wasn't certain at that moment that what I would be involved in would be unacceptable, but I was quite conscious this was a very present central issue in the operation I was becoming involved in.
Well, let's tease out that key decision-making process then of at what point it became unacceptable, because it seems to me for an awful long time it wasn't unacceptable to you, Glenn Carl. Despite all of your misgivings, you led the interrogation for a while in Morocco. You appear to have established deep misgivings about the case. You appear to have concluded pretty early on that this guy was not bin Laden's banker, was not the key high-value target he was supposed to be. But you were complicit in his rendition to Afghanistan, to a CIA black site, and you stood there and watched and were involved in interrogation, which increasingly became, and I use the word advisedly, based upon torture.
Part of that is correct, but once again, the characterization, I think, completely misunderstands what I was trying to do and what happened, actually. In the initial conversation that I've related part of, I clearly, immediately had concerns and raised them. My last point was, in this discussion, well, what about the Geneva Convention? And I was told, in response, somewhat disdainfully, well, which flag do you serve? So clearly there was a looming problem that I saw. Now, when I started to be involved in the interrogation, and throughout my involvement in it for the 10, 12 weeks, there are two types of what have come to be called enhanced interrogation measures, physical and psychological ones. And I knew from the first second, something you didn't say, but I think is as relevant as the points you did make, that I would not do. I simply would not be involved in, personally, anything physical. I would not do it. And during my time, excuse me.
It comes to this point about walking out of the room. Walking out of the room does not relieve you of responsibility.
Yeah, but listen to me. No, of course it doesn't. Whenever I had any possible indication that there would be something physical done to the man, and there were one or two instances, I stopped them. I describe in the book that there was a circle of influence that I had inside which I could operate, and outside of which there were forces, of course, acting upon me and on this detainee. And I refused to have anything to do with anything physical and stopped them whenever there was a chance. The second type of interrogation method were the psychological measures, and these are intended to dislocate, the term is dislocate psychologically the person. And I had been trained 2 decades before. I had been interrogated with them myself. The point of the interrogation training was to teach us how to cope with these measures if we were taken prisoner, a totally different thing than obtaining information. And it's a perverse twist of what the measures are intended to do. What the CIA ended up doing was perversely twisting them backwards. But I had been told that the legal definition we had been given, the operative definition also of torture, was severe and, it's a critical and disturbing article, severe and lasting pain, physical or psychological. So I thought, gosh, we're told by the experts, by the Army, by the military, CIA rather, that these things work. I had them happen to me. If it doesn't last for more than a day, the disorientation or so, gosh, this is disturbing, but this is what all of the guidance says. I quickly came, however, to feel that was all completely wrong, and to oppose those too.
Well, you opposed
so to the extent,
it.
I'll finish the last
Allow
sentence.
me, if I may, just to
I'll
ask a
finish the
question.
last sentence. I'll finish the last sentence. To the extent I had control of this individual, I opposed and would not use any of the measures.
Interesting phrasing. To the extent I had control, but a simple, if you like, yes/no question for you. During your time as a lead player in the interrogation of this particular individual, were you aware, yes or no, that techniques you yourself regarded as torture were being applied to that gentleman?
At the end, the second phase of the interrogation, the word is yes.
The word is yes. You knew. You knew it was happening.
Well, of course. I describe it.
So at what point did you wrestle
book.
with your conscience and think, I can no longer be a part of this system? I actually, frankly, I'm going to have to blow the whistle and resign from the CIA.
Begin wrestling with the issue from the first briefing, and then the decisions I had to make, and I think all of my colleagues did, was how does one act honorably and legally and fulfill one's orders. And from the first moment, I thought, this is an acute dilemma. How do I do this correctly? And during the first phase, which was the lengthiest one for me, of my involvement in the first country, I believe I was able to essentially, my interrogation consisted of asking him questions and trying to manipulate his perceptions, of course, but that's fine.
Understood.
But after that, I lost control.
Well, you did.
And I also opposed the transfer, as well as I could, I opposed the transfer of this man to the second facility. But I lost that debate, too. But the standard methods were using at least the psychological enhanced.
Well, they were more than that, weren't they? The ICRC, the Red Cross, has reported on at least 11 different methods they regard as torture, and much of it is physical, that were used against these high-value targets in places precisely like the one you were in.
Yeah, that's correct. But to my knowledge, with my the physical measures in my brief time at the second facility were not used. I'm not challenging the ICRC.
No, but before we get to the greater meaning of all this, one last question about you, Glenn Carl, and the positions you took. I mean, you describe yourself as a deeply conflicted man who's having to make very fine judgments. But the fact is, after all of this happened, 9 years or 8 years passed before this man was finally released. You spent another, at least 7 years in the agency, or 5 years in the agency, a loyal member of the CIA, knowing that this guy, whom you believe to be largely innocent, is being incarcerated in a secret CIA cell, and you did nothing about it. In fact, you describe how you wouldn't even Google his name or his case anymore because you didn't want to know what had happened to him. I just find that very hard to believe.
Well, then you needn't believe it, because that last characterization is wrong. I didn't Google him because, as an operations officer, to associate even a retired one, and this is a fine point probably of secondary concern, to associate my name potentially online with a detainee, however my views were about his innocence, the injustice, the wrong actions we might have taken, I simply wouldn't do that operationally. But it wasn't so I wouldn't know. On the larger point, it's true that after the operation, which deeply disturbed me and that I opposed and tried to change and failed in my attempt to do, I served for another 5 years in the agency. A recurring challenge, at least the term, for an agency officer is to act honorably, and for any political person involved in politics, frankly, or policy, maybe is a better term, is to serve an executive, in the case of the CIA, loyally, do one's best to act honorably, and yet be involved in policies and steps that one finds sometimes appalling. And this was the clearly, by far, the most dramatic and significant issue of that sort that I confronted, and I think the agency confronted since World War II. And that's why I wrote the book, because it's a terrible dilemma.
You have since been extremely harsh in your criticism of the Bush administration, its entire approach to the quote-unquote global war on terror. You've talked about it corrupting the flag that you had sworn to serve. But there is a case, is there not, to be made, saying that actually some of the techniques you rejected actually worked. If I'm thinking of enhanced interrogation, information, for example, that may well have led to the killing of Osama bin Laden, for example.
No, I don't think that's correct. That was put out a position advanced within 2 hours, to my astonishment. I shouldn't have been astonished, I suppose. Within 2 hours of the announcement of bin Laden's death, the defenders of the Bush administration legacy and I guess of enhanced interrogation techniques argued that thanks to these techniques, we now have bin Laden, and President Obama should apologize to the officers and thank the Bush administration.
Well, with respect, I must interrupt just to say the new chief of the CIA, who used to be an opponent of enhanced interrogation, has said after the finding and the killing of bin Laden that he acknowledged that some of the key information may have come from enhanced interrogation. He said it was an open question whether that information would have been gotten by any other means.
I think Senator McCain's comments are relevant on this specific point. He said he would not be, and I'll subscribe to his assessment too, would not be naive enough to say that enhanced interrogation methods, torture, never obtain useful information. But there are so many fundamental legal, moral, and practical problems with them that there's no justification to use them at any time. Even a broken clock works twice a day. It tells the time right twice a day, but you don't look at it or base your actions upon it. And it's so fundamentally wrong. And the evidence, I think, is overwhelming, despite what the director, DCI Panetta, has said, that enhanced interrogation techniques do not provide useful information in any commonly meaningful, effective way to assess and to use, that they should be always beyond the pale.
The group Human Rights Watch recently issued a report calling for, quote, a broad criminal investigation into alleged crimes committed in connection with the torture and ill treatment of detainees by the U.S. authorities. Do you back that desire, that demand?
I don't, but it's not to protect the guilty. The reason is as follows, and I fully will understand that any group, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, an average citizen, a journalist, would take the other side on this, and you might be correct. My goal is to have American society, therefore its operatives, repudiate ever more strongly these measures. Since 9/11, I think we have shifted the bell curve of perceptions, and things that were considered totally unacceptable and un-American and illegal are now rationally discussed as possible steps to take. So if the cost of having Americans subscribe more fully to the Convention Against Torture or Amnesty International's positions or the Geneva Conventions if the cost is letting a small number of people who wrote the policy or the legal justifications and issued the orders carry on with their lives, to me that's a small price to pay to have the entire society strengthen the laws that exist by abiding by them from the society's values.
Yeah, I mean, you're pointing to the future now, and we're going to end soon. I want to continue to think about the future, because your lessons drawn from your own experience in the past are that the notion of this global jihadi terror threat and a global response to it from the United States was misguided. It was counterproductive, and in your word, it was corrupting of the United States as well. But the question, now that we have Obama in power for more than 2-3 years, is, has anything fundamentally changed, do you believe?
Less than I had anticipated and hoped, but there still have been fundamental changes. I worked with and know pretty well John Brennan, President Obama's National Security Advisor for Terrorism, and his assessment of the nature of the jihadist threat or terrorist threat coming from turmoil in Islam, let's say, is dramatically different than the construct of the supposed global war on terror. President Obama's first executive order, I believe, or certainly in his first day, literally, as president, was to repudiate much of the concepts and the practices concerning enhanced interrogation techniques of the previous 8 years. That was all to the good. I have been surprised and disappointed that Guantanamo remains open and that there's not a legal, more even rigid repudiation of the EITs.
Glenn, Carl, I wish we had longer, but we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us from Washington, D.C.
Thank you.